Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar organized and convened by the European Policy Center. Some of you might have expected to see on this screen my good friend and colleague, Marie de Zomer. Marie was unfortunately prevented to be with us this morning by a minor health situation, and we wish her good luck and a rapid recovery. So I will try to deputize her. My name is Jean-Louis de Brouwer. I'm a senior policy advisor to the EPC, as well as the director for the European Affairs program of the Egmont Institute. This webinar this morning will focus on a joint endeavor between HCR and IOM to prepare a discussion document, which many of you were given the opportunity to have access to when linking to this webinar, which in a very documented way provides scenario building upon the present state of play, scenarios leading to policy advice to origin countries, transit countries, and destination countries, mostly on the EU-Africa link. Needless to say that the paper itself, and therefore this event dedicated to the paper, is timely, maybe a few days before the Commission will be releasing, according to rumors in the Brussels bubble, a much expected new deal or new pact, on migration and asylum, which could be a new deal, by the way, So we are very happy to have with us this morning Vincent Cochetel from HR and Ola Henriksson from IOM, who will introduce us to this paper and present us the expectations of their respective organization with regard to the shape of things to come. By the way, I think it's very, very reassuring to have such a joint up effort and endeavor between the two main agencies involved in the management of migration and mobility. There have been, urban legends in the past about possible tensions between the organization. We see how important the good cooperation between the two can be. By the way, also how important the good cooperation between Egmont and EPC can be. To comment this presentation, we are also very happy to have with us Catherine Wood, who is the Secretary General of the European Consortium for Refugee and Exile, a very important interlocutor to the EU institution when dealing with protection-related issue, but more in general with the situation of people on the move, as indeed we are more and more nowadays confronted with these mixed flows of people in the move, and which is something that ECRE as well captured and integrated into its key advocacy work. Without further ado, I will pass the floor to Vincent first by quickly reminding you the rules of the games of participants. You can ask questions. There will be, of course, a question and answer time after the presentation. You can ask questions either in writing or orally by waving the hand, which will allow us to see that you would like to take the floor and ask questions. As usual, we insist on the written question to be as short as possible, so that the moderator, votre serviteur, could be able to grasp easily what the meaning is of your intervention and put it to the attention of the speakers. Also, please indicate to whom your question is addressed in particular. But this is now well known to most of you, as we have now ventured for 3 months in the world of webinars. Let me therefore give immediately the floor to Vincent to introduce us to this paper, and then we'll pass it on to Ola. Vincent.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, and thank you very much to the European Policy Center for this invitation to share with you some observation on the impact or the likely impact of the pandemic on population movement. I think what the first thing to say is the impact is important in terms of human mobility. It has the potential to change the behavior at the individual, at the family, and at the community level. During the period of the pandemic on the African continent, the movements have continued by land and by sea. There was this consideration made by a number of politicians that, movement by sea only take place if NGOs are there to pick up people at sea. We've seen it for the last 3 months when there were no NGOs at sea. The movement exploded from Western African countries to the Canary Islands, from Algeria to Spain, from Libya to Italy and Malta, and from Tunisia to Italy. So no correlation between the presence or the availability of rescue capacity at sea and the nature and the volume of movement by sea. But movement by land have continued across the territory of Africa, in spite of the fact that 43 countries out of 54 had imposed severe border closure regime. It's difficult to capture the size and the magnitude of some of the movements because asylum procedures were suspended. People could not register a new claim. Some people decided also not to go necessarily to traditional refugee hosting area on camps and decided to either move further north, either move further south. So we should not just see those movements as unilateral movement towards North Africa, but we should see them also in terms of south-south movement. Just an indicator, a country like Burkina Faso has witnessed the displacement over the last 2 months of 228,000 people, 228,000 people. I think we need to keep those figures in mind when we have in Europe sometimes ridiculous debates about relocation of a few hundred individuals. And this is the number we know of people displaced inside Burkina Faso during the pandemic. What we don't know, because when we go to Burkina Faso, we don't see many men in IDP camps. So the men are gone. Have they gone north? We believe no, they have gone south. They have gone to West African countries where they try to find some opportunities on the local job market in order to send some remittances to their relatives in Burkina Faso. Those people have not entered the asylum channel because they are ECOWAS citizens, but at some stage they may need the protection as refugees. So displacement has continued, deportation expulsions have continued from Nigeria, from Algeria, from Libya. And what we need to see is that the impact of the COVID has been quite minimal on the African continent in terms of public health, but it's not minimal in terms of cost and socioeconomic impact on the livelihood of people in general, and that includes displaced population, that includes migrants, that includes refugees. We know from IOM studies, for instance, that migrants and refugees have lost their job. In a place like Tunisia, 53% of them have lost their job. In a place like Libya, it's a bit more difficult to calculate. Estimates vary between 75% to 50%. It's not clear to us when those people will be able to find again a job on the informal sector of the economy. It doesn't mean that everybody is going to move, so let's not panic, but maybe the competition will be harder for them with the local people. And the competition will be harder because many have faced some hostility by host communities. In many countries, refugees, migrants have been seen as the carrier, basically, of the COVID, coming from countries maybe more fragile. So they face eviction, they face eviction so from their accommodation, they face community rejection, and this may have a longer term impact on their perception of solutions on where will be their future. For many North Africa, for many migrants and refugees from sub-Saharan countries, North African countries were country of destination. They were not country of transit as we see them sometime in Europe. Now, whether that will remain the same will depend whether they find their place back in the societies that were hosting them before. We've seen challenges also in terms of access to education, another problem in terms of access to rights, and of course medical services. And that has happened also in the context of aggravating factors, food insecurity that affect many people, displaced by conflict, or people displaced because of extreme weather or locust infestation in East Horn of Africa. Another aggravating factor is the security deterioration in many parts of the world, but more particularly in the Sahel region and in Libya. We've seen also governments using human rights derogation under the pretext of protecting population against the COVID. So that leads to some challenges as to, for instance, in several countries in Africa, at least in 14 countries in Africa, whether we will have election this year, whether election will be postponed, whether people can travel for the election. And we see some governments trying to, abuse of their power beyond constitutional limits. The fact that IOM on us had to suspend, voluntary repatriation program in many places, resettlement program, has also created some despair in some communities. People feel stuck, stranded, without any solution. It does not mean that everybody will cross the Mediterranean or the Atlantic. As a matter of fact, we see new routes developing towards the Canary Islands, in particular from Western Sahara. We'll see also that route developing to Portugal over the last couple of days. So again, the human traffickers seems to be quicker to adapt their offer than political minds to adapt policies to make them work a bit better. So the big question is to what extent European countries, but also North African countries are prepared. For European countries, the key questions are we better prepared than in 2015? Will the pact provide all the remedies? What sort of consensus and compromise will be built around that pact? And for North African countries, about time, 50 years after their adoption of the 1951 Convention, we have yet to see one of these countries adopting asylum legislation. And the crisis in North Africa has shown positive sign of inclusion, sometimes of refugees and migrant people in, for instance, health response, but it has shown also that the lack of migration management framework and the lack of asylum framework have put people in a much more precarious situation that we had initially envisaged. So lots of challenge, again, no panic, but we need to make the full use of all the processes that we have ahead of us, not just at the European level, but the revision of the Joint Valletta Plan of Action, the preparation for the post-Cotonou agreement, the EU strategy with Africa. There are a number of frameworks where we're gonna need to rebalance all the interest on both sides of the Mediterranean to try to develop that space for asylum and migration management better. That's in the interest of everyone, and in particular, migrants and refugees. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Let me now pass the floor to Ola. I should have mentioned in my introduction to you that, of course, the numerous posts and the responsibilities that you occupied in HCR has made you a quite knowledgeable interlocutor with regard to, on one end, the EU institution and EU member states. You have occupied several positions in Brussels, but also on the other end, your present position, you are really, I would call you the ambassador at large of HCR to exactly cover the kind of issues that you presented us today. Similarly, I mean, Ola, you have joined recently, well, not so recently anymore, by the way, IOM as the regional director for Europe, Norway, Norway, Switzerland, and I think Ireland also, if my memory is correct. But okay, you are well known to have been the representative of Sweden in different capacity. For years, you have accompanied the development of the EU agenda in different positions and be a key interlocutor at all stages of your career within the Swedish administration. Ola, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Louis, and good morning, everybody. Human mobility and cross-border trade will be essential to our recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. Recovering and moving again offers an opportunity to strengthen our societies. Reopening external borders to human mobility and to flow of goods will be socially, economically, and politically essential. We have seen how seasonal workers, for example, are critical to our economy. In a post-pandemic area, migrant workers will also be essential in Europe's socio-economic reconstruction as recovery agents. In that sense, it will be important to promote market-responsive labor mobility schemes. But to do mobility right, pandemic-related safety measures taken at points of entry must be coordinated and consistent with those at ports of departure. Revised procedures, adapted equipment, tailored trainings, and adjusted infrastructure will be needed to safeguard the health of both travelers and border officials. In the interest of facilitating safe, regular, and orderly migration, internal and external cross-border procedures should integrate efficient and thorough health screening measures. The COVID-19 situation has highlighted the need for further international cooperation. The many thousands of migrants that were stranded by border closures are a case in point. The situation demonstrated the need and the value of partnerships on consular services, return, readmission, and regularization. This kind of cooperation can ensure that no one is left behind or lacks access to vital health services. The virus also showed how digitalization helped to prevent isolation and discontinuity in public services. Likewise, migration management will have to adapt to the digital era. Digitalization can be used to promote a transparent and easier cross-border process for EU citizens and residents. It can also facilitate immigration procedures for non-EU citizens and safeguard personal data. The COVID-19 crisis has heightened the social tensions and increased the stigmatization and discrimination of migrants, at times being scapegoated as disease spreaders. This points to the importance of pursuing our collective efforts in balancing messaging and promoting evidence-based discourses on migration to combat xenophobia and promote social cohesion. We must reimagine the future of international human mobility as a process that is inclusive, regular, and safe and rights-based. Now moving to irregular migration at EU's external sea borders in the central Mediterranean. Despite the pandemic, migrants continue to embark on dangerous crossings in the Mediterranean. While numbers are still very low compared to previous years, almost twice as many migrants and as many people have attempted to flee Libya via the central Mediterranean route in 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. Approximately 60% of those who embark from Libya successfully disembark in either Malta or Italy. Government's responses to COVID-19 have included port closures, delays in disembarkation, and reduced search and rescue presence. Meanwhile, public health measures adopted in response to the pandemic have forced many search and rescue NGOs to curtail their activities. Saving lives must remain the #1 priority. IOM is deeply concerned about reports that states have been ignoring or delaying responses to distress calls. Increased state-led search and rescue capacity and coordination is needed. The pandemic cannot be an excuse to keep people away from dry land. Migrants have been left on board vessels, sometimes for weeks, without any clarity on disembarkation. States must continue to disembark people rescued at sea in line with international maritime and human rights obligations. This is doable, even more important during the COVID-19. Public health measures such as time-limited quarantine, medical screening, and physical distancing must be applied without discrimination. Prompt disembarkation must also be supported by tangible solidarity from European states. We need to move away from perpetual cycles of negotiations and ad hoc arrangements. IOM has been supporting relocation over the past years and even during the COVID-19 period. This experience from EU-wide emergency relocation scheme from 2016 to 2018 and the lessons learned from supporting member states in the ad hoc initiatives in Greece and Malta can act as a guidance for how COVID-19-proof future solidarity mechanisms can be schemed. Based on these initiatives to which we have contributed, we feel that a permanent mechanism would benefit from clear eligibility criteria and responsibilities for involved actors. We would like to see future relocation exercises to be more transparent. Waiting times for those who are eligible for relocations need to be reduced. Improvements like this can build more trust in the system and reduce the risk of absconding and secondary movements. Finally, post-disembarkation arrangements also need to consider return options for those who are not authorized to remain in the host states. Effective return, readmission, and reintegration policies are important for maintaining integrity and credibility of both refugee and migrant policies. A recent Commission guideline highlighted that more than ever, voluntary returns should be prioritized as they lower the health and safety risk for return operations. Any gap in funding for voluntary returns due to delays in the MFF negotiation is worrisome. COVID-19 is an opportunity to retune dialogue and partnerships on returns. EU initiatives to assess new partnerships, approach and migration compacts are welcome. In this context, it will be important to look to the operational and political coordination between EU member states, external cooperation with EU partner countries. In Africa, there have been important efforts to boost migrant assistance along migration routes, expand voluntary return possibility for stranded migrants, and enhance reception and reintegration capacities in countries of origin. The EU Trust Fund for Africa has provided critical support for these activities. It will be important to sustain this investment. It is also crucial to consolidate capacities and adapt systems that have been established in the COVID-19 context. COVID-19 has provided an opportunity to test new approaches and lessons forward. It has focused our attentions on the contributions of the many migrants who are on the front line. They are critical workers providing healthcare and services, keeping our global food production and supply chains going. We need to value and recognize their contributions to our societies. In fact, many governments have set positive examples to ensure that migrants are included as part of their comprehensive response to COVID-19. These examples offer long-term lessons on cooperation, inclusion, and leaving no one behind. Ultimately, the crisis is a chance to strengthen our collective, to resolve, to preserve life, protect rights, and find common lasting solutions to challenges that affect us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ola. In a way, your conclusions point to the fact that, after all, the crisis that we are faring through for the time being could offer more opportunities than challenges. But the question is, of course, will these opportunities be used by the decision makers at EU level, whether it is within the institutions or the member states? Corina, I would like now to turn to you. I stressed earlier the formidable advocacy capacity of the consortium you are steering. I mean, do you share the main element of the analysis presented by our colleague of IOM and HR? And would you support their main recommendations to whoever is in charge of could be in charge of implementing them? Catherine, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. And I would say on the whole, we do share most of the recommendations that come out of this very interesting paper. I'm going to structure my response in the form of 3 different reflections. The first one is an overall assessment looking at the analysis in the paper and our own analysis of the COVID emergency. Secondly, negative changes to resist. And thirdly, positive changes to consolidate, which builds on some of the points just mentioned. So looking at our overall assessment, this COVID emergency has, of course, had great costs in Europe. We know that, human and financial costs. It's also had a strong impact on many of our members, particularly those working directly with communities. All of that said, this emergency will not radically change things in Europe. It won't radically change things in this area of policy or perhaps in any other. It's not going to shift paradigms in Europe. The far greater impact is the global one. And this comes across very well in the paper, and I think in the comments that we've just had. Increasing displacement, all kinds of potential impacts from increased conflict, food security problems, etc., etc. I won't repeat them. For that reason, we would urge a rethinking of European external policies. looking country by country at the impact of this health emergency in the context of what is already happening, the vulnerabilities, the resilient structures, the displacement factors in those particular countries. All analysis should be context specific, but in this case, because of the variety of different trends that we see with COVID, it's particularly important. A country that is very high on our agenda at the moment is Afghanistan. We've just put out a policy note urging member states not to be deporting people to Afghanistan in general, is our position, but certainly not while Afghanistan is going to have a particularly negative impact from this crisis. So I think it's about looking at how external policies can be suitably broad and not allowing the continuation of this trend that sees a capture of external policies for Europe's own prevention of migration objectives, because there will be increased needs there. So external policies need to look at security, livelihoods, development, health provision, all the things they should be looking at. And I would say in relation to this, one of the interesting things that has happened is that the pull factor argument is well and truly debunked. Now, we've been arguing anyway, given the 30+ studies that show that pull factors don't exist anyway, that shouldn't be the basis of policy making for Europe. And one of the things that comes out of this crisis is that particularly uses of the pull factor argument are particularly flawed. I'll come back to that shortly. Second point, negative developments which should be repealed. And we see some of these noted in the paper, but we've also heard both UNHCR and IOM vocal on some of these negative developments in Europe. Some of the changes introduced by European states were valid as temporary responses to COVID. Others were not. We saw that COVID was used as an excuse for anti-asylum measures to be introduced. This is the case in Greece, for instance, in Cyprus, but also for anti-democratic measures disguised as migration control. Hungary, of course, is the most prominent example, but there was also a need to resist proposed changes in Slovenia, for instance, where COVID was being used to justify pre-planned measures to restrict civil society. Luckily, the opposition came back against that. Our particular concerns, I think, are also noted in this paper. Access to asylum procedures, suspension of procedures in policy and de facto, and then access to territory, with an escalation of border violence and the disembarkation problem with ports being closed. I think here now we would need to see a strong voice from not just IOM and UNHCR, but also from the EU institutions, and in particular the Commission, to speak out against some of these flagrant violations that are taking place. Otherwise, there's a risk that they become normalised and that they may become permanent almost. Some of these are small measures, such as, for instance, the switch to using Skype interviews instead of in-person interviews in an asylum procedure. Now, our evidence shows that this actually restricts people's access to a fair procedure because the complexity of many cases means that an in-person interview is essential, also to have access to legal assistance, and a Skype interview is just not adequate. And we see certain member states, including Belgium, moving to try and render permanent some of those changes that were put in place due to or during the crisis. And I think more worrying is something like continued impunity for violence at borders. And there the situation in Croatia is one that's been highlighted. The flagrant violations that were taking place during this standoff in Malta, with people stranded on boats for up to 4 weeks. These are things where we need to see the Commission speaking out. When it does, there is an impact. So, for instance, emphasising that in Greece, the suspension of the asylum procedure was not justified and shouldn't continue seems to have an effect, because we've seen a reinstatement there. I know this is a sensitive issue because of the need to get agreement across the member states on the recovery plan, the need to get agreement on the MFF, but some of those countries that are engaged in measures that risk becoming permanent are also those that will benefit from recovery plan money and so on. So the pressure can also go the other way. It's not just about them blackmailing in order to continue with some of these violations. The final point, my final point, is the question of positive developments. We hesitate sometimes to use the word opportunity because it seems inappropriate given everything that's happened. However, there are positive developments that could be consolidated. The first is a rather intangible one. I think there is a realization that displaced people in Europe are more vulnerable because of deliberate policy choices. They've been left in destitution and in detention. And this results from decisions that have been made. And those decisions are now seen to have an impact more widely, including on health. So I think there is a growing understanding that some of these deterrent punitive measures are bad generally. Secondly, it puts things in perspective, particularly if we're talking about something like security threats. Refugees crossing a border is not a major security risk. A pandemic is. Therefore, resources, priorities need to shift. Thirdly, we see concrete positive changes, easing of detention regimes, with the most stark examples being Spain and the UK. Regularisation, tentative but important, and an expansion of the right to work, different categories of people seeking asylum, and a certain improvement in reception conditions and tackling homelessness among people on the move. So to conclude, what we would want to see from the Pact is that some of those positive developments are then incorporated at the level of policy, rhetoric, discourse, direction that's provided by the EU. And that concerns both the asylum situation in Europe and Europe's external policies. And then we would at the same time want to see a strong line to make sure that some of the negative measures are repealed straight away. I think what comes across strongly in the paper from the two agencies is the need to emphasise access to asylum. And this is something that I hope can be at the centre of the Pact. I'll conclude with what we might call a COVID justification, which is in this time of emergency, everybody uses COVID to say, well, COVID shows why we were right all along, or COVID demonstrates why our recommendations are important. And our recommendations for the Pact were that it focuses on functioning asylum systems in Europe, compliance with the asylum standards that are in place, with reform not on reception decision-making. Their compliance is necessary to end the flagrant abuses by member states, but reform is needed on the solidarity piece. As we all know, it's a banalité to say that there are problems with Dublin. In the meantime, before that reform takes place, temporary solidarity measures, again as demonstrated, and it was positive that the relocation efforts continued despite the crisis. And I think this shows where we want to see the Commission putting its efforts as well, to be facilitating that kind of agreement until we see a permanent reform of the allocation system. Plus, other important things from the Pact: inclusion through rights, through the right to work, through the right to housing, rather than integration through preaching about European values when we see many leaders moving away from those values anyway. I hope and I trust, in fact, that we will see that in the Pact. And then finally, the question of external policies doing what they're supposed to be doing, not being captured for the prevention of migration. I would say we're not necessarily optimistic. I think we will see in the Pact some of those positive measures. I hope we will see an emphasis on access to asylum, as strongly argued by the two agencies. I think, unfortunately, we're still likely to see these measures that aim at expanding the use of substandard border procedures and containment at borders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you also to Ola and Vincent. I mean, Ola, Vincent, I will give you the opportunity in a second to comment on what you heard from Catherine. She was pretty much in line with your analysis and suggestion, but I heard also some divergence between what I found in the document and her comment and suggestions. In the meanwhile, may I ask the participant not to shy away from asking questions. I have with me my friend and colleague Alberto Neidhart, who helped convening this event, ready to collect the questions. So please use the tools that are made available to you, either in writing or orally, to participate into this exchange of view. Catherine, what struck me in listening to you is that in a way you implicitly highlight some of the, underlying tensions in this whole migration-related debate. First, it confirms a growing feeling that I've had after these 3 months, is that in many policy areas, in many areas of the lives of our communities and societies, actually the COVID-19 pandemics did not create new obstacles or challenges. It simply illustrated, exacerbated existing weaknesses. And of course, I mean, as we say in French or bad English, it showed that very often the king was naked, actually. So the second thing is, of course, the proposal of the Commission, of the pact to be expected by the Commission, is one thing. But what the member states will do with it is another thing. I mean, and we're going to see it as far as the big debate about the MFF and the recovery package of the Commission, which starts at this very moment in the European Council. It's going to be, a forerunner of the things to come in terms of how member states are accepting or not, how member states are chewing the Commission proposal, how audacious they could be. And last thing, okay, it's certainly about narratives. I mean, everybody dealing with migration and displacement knows our narratives are important, but at a certain point in time, these narratives have to translate into action, and they have to shape either legislation or common practices, because the question is also to know whether legislation is always needed to sort out a certain number of issues which were cruelly illustrated by the pandemics. But as I said earlier, Ola and Vincent, having heard what Catherine said, would you like to comment and further elaborate on her suggestions and contribution? Vincent?
Thank you, Jean-Louis. I think I share in general the analysis of Catherine. I think one of the also positive development we've seen in Europe was, this possibility for asylum seeker in a number of countries, not all of them, but to apply for asylum by remote. So the use of technology to facilitate the registration of an asylum application. Many countries are so centralized and so complicated in terms of access to asylum. So I think that good practice that was initiated during the pandemic should become one of the options for people to apply for asylum, a standard option. I thought that was quite an important development, because then it gives automatically also temporary documentation to people on a proof that they are seeking protection. I'm less pessimistic than Catherine about border procedure. We don't like that, but there is no way around that. The wave through approach that we have seen in 2015 cannot happen again. If we want to maintain public support for asylum system, if we want to have more public support for legal migration, there has to be order in the house. And order in the house means serious reduction of secondary movement and means better processing at border. And when we say at border, it's on the EU territory soil under European law, and with the guarantees of the acquis attached to that screening. But the position of certain states that think that, everybody should be relocated is just not realistic. I mean, some of the people do not have a claim for asylum, others have a manifestly unfounded claim. I'm still very influenced with what I saw in Pozzallo when the hotspot opened in Italy. I spent 6 hours in Pozzallo interviewing maybe 20 people, short interview with interpreters. You know, when people are just arrived, okay, they need to recover a bit. But I mean, when they tell you the story, the fresh story, it's easy to determine who might be a victim of trafficking, who might be a genuine asylum seeker, who has no asylum claim. But if you let those people go through various territories 1 year later when their asylum claim is heard, because eventually they all apply for asylum, the story is not the same. So a border procedure will enable us to screen in more quickly some genuine applicants or victims of trafficking, will also help us to screen out people who have no vocation to remain in Europe. And as long as we don't address that reality, we are not going to be able to convince Italy, Malta, and other countries that they should reopen their port, that they should do more on rescue at sea. They need solutions. It does not justify some of the politics of avoidance that we have seen in the central Mediterranean over the last couple of months. There is no justification for that, as you said. But at the same time, there are certain realities. I mean, the reception system in Malta is full. They have a huge search and rescue area of responsibility. And at the end of the day, they need solidarity. I mean, we've blamed them for not disembarking those 425 migrants and asylum seekers for 4 weeks. Fine. Then they have the allowed disembarkation. How many today have been relocated? How many countries have stepped up to relocation efforts? To the best of my knowledge, only 4. 4 countries in the European Union have agreed on a voluntary basis to take some of the people disembark. And we don't know what number, what proportion. We don't know what are the needs for relocation also from the Maltese authorities. Not everybody needs to be relocated. So that solidarity needs to be predictable. And if it is still a voluntary mechanism that we see in the proposal of the Commission, which is very likely, what sort of other flexible support other states will have to give, because they have to give something also. It's not fair to expect so few countries to assume the responsibility for asylum in Europe. The others have to participate in other meaningful ways to the response. Over.
Ola, up to you.
Thank you. I want to pick up on a few points which was mentioned by you, Jean-Louis, and also with Vincent on digitalization and legislation. I think the EU has worked on legislation to try and harmonize procedures for 20 years now, since the entry into force of the Amsterdam Treaty. I think it also comes to how this is actually applied, what resources you put behind it, and what means you can use. And I think what Vincent said about digital application also goes for other ways of access to the territory. And I think by using simpler, faster procedures for those who are bona fide migrants going here, you could also avoid people going into more irregular paths. If the waiting times for family reunification or to come as a student or for work is very lengthy and expensive, then of course you have alternative markets, so to say, which would possibly attract people going in other ways. I think that is also an opportunity with new border procedures, with digitalization, to use this to provide smoother pathways for those who are eligible to come anyway. And I think that I think is also something that is being requested by the private sectors and others. So no, it's not just about legislation. It's very much about the implementation and putting the resources and the administrative capabilities into doing this. And I think also on the narrative, picking up what you said earlier here, also we saw with the regularizations or extension of permits the need for migrants in different parts of society, and that you can actually act quick within the legislation to take provisions to make sure that people are not put in an unnecessarily vulnerable situation, and where they also can provide services to our societies, being it in the food supply chains or in health service or whatever. So my comments at this stage. Over.
Thank you very much. Well, it seems that we still have no questions. So more probably, I mean, there is such a consensus within the audience about what you presented and the solution that you propose that our colleagues, our friends attending this webinar do not feel the need to comment or intervene. I will pass you the floor immediately, Catherine, but let me also therefore abuse of my privilege as a moderator. I would like to ask the three of you two questions, which could be the million-dollar questions. After all, many of the suggestions that are even to be found in the paper or put forward by you, Catherine, have been on the table for years, if not decennia. I mean, if you take the example of the disembarkation scheme, you will not find one single resolution of the European Parliament, for instance, where they don't insist on the need to agree on such a disembarkation scheme. And yet it is not there. So first question, what made you are the three of you well versed into the way the EU and its institutions do function. What could make us all together more optimistic that this time there must be a way ahead to have at least some of these suggestions duly taken into consideration and reflected not only in the Commission proposal, but in the position that member states will take. And bear in mind that unfortunately they have decided at European Council level that all that would be agreed upon on the basis of a consensual approach, so that all states could by miracle agree on this. Second question, I draw the conclusion from the analytical part of the HCR IOM paper that there is a very serious risk that over the summer we see again a steep increase of irregular cross-border, mostly through the central Mediterranean routes. If the Commission tables its paper by the end of the month of June, as it has announced, by that time, member states might have engaged into an inward-looking discussion on a series of solutions, but still with no answer, no short-term answer and response to, I mean, the new arrivals that it's again one of the scenarios that is mentioned in your paper that we could be confronted with. So the question is, what's going to happen? What are we going to do? Are we going again to muddle through with the endless ad hoc negotiation, or do you think that it could trigger something else than a knee-jerk reaction? But Catherine, you wanted first to comment on these comments, and then I will further elaborate on these two questions. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. In fact, let me respond immediately to the first of your questions. Many of these proposals have been on the table for a long time. Why are they not then adopted? And we could say perhaps because our advocacy is not very successful, might be one conclusion. I would say that a different strategy has been pursued. And since 2016, the strategy for most of the EU's institutions has been the prevention of arrivals. So we saw, for instance, the 2016 asylum reform package proposed by the Commission is a set of legislative proposals that attempt to codify the EU-Turkey deal model. And this is about, in our view, denying access to asylum. So one of the things we propose is compliance, not reform. And that means we want to emphasize that the standards largely are in place, and we would like to see the Commission, but also EASO, focusing on ensuring compliance. So for instance, on something like reception conditions, which in some countries, as we know, are totally inadequate, and that's a reason for secondary movement. And we've identified 5 implementation gaps when it comes to the implementation of the SEAS, and would like to see resources focused there. Of course, the caveat always is that the piece that does need reforming is the allocation system, the solidarity piece, soi-disant. And that then I think takes us to the stalemate there and how to overcome this stalemate. I would use that to sort of segue into something of a response to Vincent there. The deal that is being offered or that's been under discussion is that the countries at the borders accept the idea of a mandatory border procedure and in exchange get additional solidarity measures. I think at many times this is not actually a good deal for those countries. If a border procedure means making mandatory border procedure instead of the regular asylum procedure at centres at the border, I think it's very problematic for border countries. I mean, not least because they have to manage essentially detention centres at borders, and after 4 weeks, if the case is not concluded, then we're into detention territory. But also you need judicial infrastructure there if that will be the main purpose for procedure. At the moment, member states have the option of using that kind of border procedure, and many choose not to do that. But it exists already in law. So yes, now the discussion has moved to say screening process instead. On that, it's very hard to comment until we know the details. The devil is, of course, in the detail. There can be advantages of a screening process, and not least something like rapid early identification of vulnerabilities. I think it just depends how that then relates to the asylum procedure. Is that then access to a full asylum procedure with proper procedural guarantees? I will let me wrap up now so you can bring in some of the others. I think the question for us, the pact itself, we sort of know what will be in there. And I think we can say one thing, the pact will probably please nobody. Because it will be bits and pieces of everything, but it's a political document. What's important is it accompanied by legislative proposals? And there we will have to see. We are hearing a more positive narrative from the Commissioner, which I think is important, and she is insistent on not tolerating xenophobic discourse, for instance. I would also add the populists, extremists, have had a bad crisis, but they will be back. So we need to see a continuation from people in positions of leadership of just using different language and different discourse. And that includes also saying that this is not the major challenge crisis that faces Europe. There are practical solutions, and they are based on making asylum function here, so that then we can also engage in a credible way in ensuring protection elsewhere in the world.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I will ask Ola and Vincent to hold their horses for a while, because we have now the first question coming from the audience. And I will now turn to Alberto Neidhart to inform us about these questions and transmit them to us. Alberto, the floor is yours. Alberto, yes, there you are.
Good morning, everyone. We have several questions on the border procedure, which was just mentioned by Catherine. Participants raised concern particularly on what will happen to asylum seekers who will be detained at the border and won't be able to be returned. The report also discusses return procedures and how COVID-19 and the situation in countries of origin and transit may complicate further relocation. So if you could comment on these. And then also Marco Funk from FES in relation to asylum procedure raises the question on how to ensure that the initial reception is organized in a way to avoid overcrowded facilities in frontline member states. We also have questions on permanent solidarity, particularly on the mandatory relocation system, and given that Catherine just commented on the upcoming new pact, and perhaps we shouldn't have too high expectations about these. There are questions about whether we can expect the new pact to also include some proposal on permanent solidarity, and whether the situation that we are currently facing could demonstrate the need and incentivize member states to actually decide on solidarity-based mechanisms, and also perhaps of course, also on relocations from frontline states.
Okay, so there are a vast series of questions. I see also that someone has asked to put an oral question. I will come back to that person immediately afterwards. But so if I would say, let's start maybe with Vincent and then turn to Ola and Catherine about the several issues kindly summarized by Alberto in his intervention. Vincent?
Thank you, Jean-Louis. I'll try to answer the questions on some of the comments from Kathy in response to your question, Jean-Louis. Yes, if we have highly mediatized sea crossing during the summer, that will have the potential to constitute something very toxic for the discussion on the pact. Because it's going to be extremely politicized, even more than what we have seen so far in the countries of arrival. And that's why we cannot afford losing time on the solidarity mechanism. If that solidarity mechanism, the one which will be presented in the pact, cannot be put in place quickly, well, let's return to the temporary arrangement agreed upon by some states in September 2019 in Malta. It's not perfect, but let's make that one work. And as Catherine said, nothing prevents states today, Malta, Italy and others, to implement a border procedure with all the legal safeguards, but to implement it with the support of the European agencies that can help. But we need to front load the capacity of those agencies to make it work and avoid the overcrowding and the length of time we see for the processing of application in Greece, for instance. There's no reason for that. That can be managed more efficiently. There again, you could have teams that interview overnight. Why not? Why not work in shift? It's possible to work differently with those arrival and make sure that we have a much faster processing of the arrival to avoid the overcrowding. Yes, there might be some restriction to the freedom of movement. Let's avoid those border procedures to turn into detention camps. No one wants to use the word European Processing Center. It's taboo, it's too federal and all that. So let's scrap it. Let's talk border procedure. Actually, I don't really like the concept of border procedure per se. I would prefer European Processing Center, but since I understand it's not on the table, let's not discuss those proposals. But we need to mutualize the capacity to make it work on relocation, to make it work on return. Because also asylum system dysfunction, because less than 50% of the return decisions are executed. As long as we don't solve that, we can't solve the other parts of the puzzle. I agree with Catherine that there are several different still among member states on reception conditions that lead to secondary movement. That's one reason. There are other reasons. But we need to look into that also seriously, because the majority of European states were quite pleased with the situation during COVID, where there was no secondary movement because of the closure of the internal border. So the reopening comes with some apprehension. They know they could not keep those internal borders closed for a long time. But I don't think governments nor the public at large has much tolerance anymore for a lot of uncontrolled movement. Whereas if we can regulate those movements from those border procedures through relocation, and as Ola said, from working more on legal pathways, on making them safe and fast for people, so they don't turn to smugglers who have become the best provider of family reunion in Europe, then maybe things will work a bit better. But I'm not the one who says, you know, Dublin is so unfair, let's throw Dublin. Yes, what was the situation in Europe before? It was chaos. It was people submitting asylum applications successively in several countries. It was unmanaged. So, you know, Dublin is not perfect. Dublin does not work very well, but we need a certain number of systems like that in place to create that balance of responsibility in Europe on effective and predictable solidarity. Over.
Ola?
Thank you. I would like actually to start with your question about the disembarkation and the solidarity. And I think if with the consensus now on the table, I think political leaders ultimately need to ask themselves why there is cooperation in this area in the EU, and go back to where this actually stems from with the Schengen cooperation and internal market, and to see where the incentives to actually have an agreement lies. Without that, I think it will be harder. On the border procedures, I pretty much agree with what Vincent is saying. I think those will be, if they are conducted in a safe manner, they can be useful. There were also some questions on return. Of course, the capacity to facilitate returns have been very limited due to COVID-19, but I think there is also quite a significant request for being able to be given the opportunity to return to the countries of origin. We've seen a number of migrants who have been stranded in different parts of the world, and we have been called upon by governments to assist those. And so I think this is also to be taken into consideration, that there are actually quite a few people who want to go back to their countries of origin for all kinds of reasons. And I think it can be conducted. Of course, it needs to be COVID responsive, but I see that we can do it. And also now air traffic is picking up. There are different ways of dealing with this. I think one of the challenges looking at how we will manage the situation is the asymmetry and the lack of coordination between governments in lifting borders, introducing border controls, not just in Europe but worldwide. I think that needs to be adjusted, because the side effects of this are quite significant. So I think that, and again, going back to the question also about what will happen in the summer if this increases, I think it again shows that it calls for more international cooperation and discussions. Europe can't solve this on its own. It needs to engage with the countries of origin and transit on an equal footing. Over.
Thank you. Catherine, would you like to add anything to your previous comment?
A couple of small remarks on my side. I think as we move out of this COVID emergency, we will be seeing a backlog in a number of countries when it comes to asylum applications, and this is just inevitable. And I think this again for us will demonstrate the need to invest in those asylum systems and get them functioning properly. And something like, as Vincent mentioned, I mean, the processing time in some cases is already scandalous. But there we see one of the implementation gaps that we identified that we would like to see filled is the question of registration. And I think you then come back to the question of strategy and use of resources. So is EASO in Greece assisting with registration of applicants, which it has contributed extremely well, or are its resources focused on trying to return Syrians to Turkey, which is a bit of a road to nowhere in every sense? So I think what we would like to see in terms of this big political deal that's under discussion, which can be loosely described as solidarity in exchange for something. I think we would like to see that as solidarity in exchange for compliance with existing EU asylum, international human rights and international refugee law, not to mention international law of the sea, which is also in question now. That exchange, rather than we offer you a small amount of solidarity in exchange for imposing a problematic border procedure. I think nobody expects reform of Dublin anytime soon. I mean, probably not in any of our lifetimes. So for that reason, and for sort of pragmatic reasons, we've also strongly recommended this kind of temporary solidarity mechanisms. I mean, the more and more formalized they can be, the better. And I think there is progress there. We have an emerging coalition of the willing who have been stepping in, and at one point after the France and Germany brokered an agreement, there were around 14 countries who were one way or another in this. And unfortunately, we have no choice but to activate those kind of mechanisms as a humanitarian imperative when people attempt to cross, which they will do because of the push factors that lead them to try to seek protection in Europe. When it comes to the underlying issues, we know that it's a complex package. It's not a solution. It's partly about asylum functioning in Europe, but it's also, of course, about safe and legal channels and including legal migration for the non-asylum piece. And I feel somewhat more optimistic in some of those areas that there is a chance now to push for those changes that will then mean fewer people need to try to arrive in a way that risks their lives. Finally, on return, this is also part of the picture, but in our view, there has been really an extensive focus on deportation. So it is there, but it's not the answer. It is, again, one aspect of this extremely complex picture and one that has benefited from significant attention. Let's also have the attention on making sure that member states manage functioning asylum systems, because it's, in some senses, much easier than trying to export everybody to other countries.
Thank you very much, Catherine. As you all noticed, we are slightly beyond schedule, but I will still take two questions. One is a question from Mr. or Mrs. Rory Topping. I unmute you if you're still with us, and you can ask your question, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Rory Topping, Frontex Liaison Officer in Brussels. Thanks a lot for the invitation to this exchange. Very interesting. Also, thanks for the joint paper. It's difficult from our perspective not to agree with the assessment that cross-border, cross-regional population movements are indeed likely to increase as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. We might only mention, as an additional factor, the impact of oil prices as well on Middle Eastern countries, obvious repercussions for migrant worker populations, and remittances may also lead to increased migration movements potentially to Europe. Of course, in the medium term, we see that the migration to Europe will still depend largely on when and to what extent key countries of transit and origin will lift restrictions on movements. But we also see an expectation that there is a sizable backlog of migrants who still wish to travel to Europe, and in the immediate term may do so whilst they see it as feasible. Just as a question, then, to spur a little the final comments, would be interested to know, to draw out a little more your thoughts on the specific figures announced in the Commission's revision of the MFF, how do you assess them, and specifically in relation to migration, and maybe if you have time, just how you see these MFF negotiations progressing in the European Council. Thank you.
Well, I think that on your second question, I would recommend you to attend another webinar, which is going to be organized by EPC this afternoon, precisely with my colleague Yanis Emanuelidis and Fabian Zuleg, precisely about a first assessment of the outcome of this morning Heads of States and Government video conference. Alberto, you mentioned that you had a question on resettlement. The floor is yours.
Yes, there was also a question whether complementary pathways and resettlement could lead to better solutions. And we know that IOM and UNHCR have announced today that resettlement have restarted. So I believe this is a timely question. And also in relation to these, whether and what can the European Union do to stimulate resettlement and complementary pathways in the short and in the long run?
Thank you very much, Alberto. So if anyone wants, our panelists would like to take one or the other of the two questions and try to keep your comment as brief as possible this time. Thank you very much. I see Catherine certainly, and then Vincent, Ola, according to your wishes. Catherine.
Great, thanks very much. I'll come in on financial issues. In response to the last question, resettlement and complementary pathways, you know, again, it's something that everybody is recommending, of course. How could you not? That there should be increased numbers. But what we need is really a massive expansion of what Europe does in terms of allowing people who need protection to arrive safely through those channels. One way to increase this is to use EU funding. And ECRE and UNHCR actually jointly prepared a study which looks at EU funding as an incentive for increasing resettlement from outside Europe, but also actually for as an incentive for relocation within Europe. And one of the conclusions is that there's great potential for better use of that funding to increase and incentivize member states to use safe and legal channels. Second point, MFF. It's not the absolute figures for asylum and migration that count, it's how the money is used. So we've recommended on AMIF, for instance, the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund that was for a while AMF, but is now AMIF again, probably, that there needs to be a balance in that spending so that all the priorities are covered adequately. That means the priority for asylum capacity, the priority for integration, and then the third priority is return. And we've always seen a risk that member states will disproportionately spend in some areas and not use that money to be supporting integration or asylum capacity development. So I think similarly, something like the IBMF, the Border Management Fund, it should not just be about preventing access at borders. It also needs to be about supporting independent border monitoring, because we know that there is widespread violence at the EU's borders, and the current discussion about Croatia demonstrates that money that is actually supposed to be used for independent border monitoring is not being used in that way. So I think it's about the nuance, not about the absolute figures. Finally, I return to the very first point at the beginning, which was external affairs funding, which cannot be captured for certain attempts to contain or prevent migration, but needs to be used to tackle causes of displacement and to build up asylum capacity and other positive things in other countries.
Thank you very much for this remarkably frugal comment, Catherine. It's not the total amount of money which counts, it is the way it's spent. I've heard that sometime somewhere. Vincent, and then
very quickly, I will not comment on the MFF, rather on resettlement. Well, I don't see much appetite at this stage of European states to further increase resettlement, unfortunately, in spite of the incentive. That's a pity, but Europe has made some progress over the last 4 years, and we should continue. However, I see the potential for European Union member states to unleash the potential of authorized communities, vetted communities, to organize private sponsorship resettlement. I see last week Italy again showed the lead. Italy, 20 universities in Italy have decided to sponsor the refugee students to come and settle in Italy with the authorization on the security vetting of the Italian authorities. Why can't the top 20 universities in all European countries do the same? I mean, we have potential there. These are wealthy institutions that could sponsor some refugees, all of them. So I see that potential, that dynamic, that capital of solidarity that exists in European society need to be unleashed to promote those legal pathways. And let's make them work on incentivized. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ola?
Thank you. A few comments on the MFF. Of course, it's important how the money is spent, not just how much money is in every envelope. I think also not just on what purposes, but also how this is administered and the call for simplification that has been there. There is a certain level of underspending of some of those justice and home affairs funds, and I think that needs to be looked into. Then, of course, there is the external relations part where there's a lot of money that potentially will go to migration-related issues under whether it will be called NDICI or whatever in the future. I think what is also a concern talking about MFF is the time frame for when it will be adopted, because we are now coming to the very end of the current MFF, and there might be a gap in funding, and that in turn could be potentially a bit disruptive. So we really would like to see a fast conclusion on this, because then the co-legislator has to agree on each and every fund. So that's a bit of a concern on our part. On the resettlement, I pretty much agree with previous speakers. I think it's important that European countries stick to their promises. I think it's roughly 30,000 this year. And of course, with COVID-19, it might not be possible for all of them to do all of this, but I think as much as possible to stick to the numbers and the promises and see the potential for increase. And it's important also, again, that there are the incentives, the financial incentives coming out of the EU funding. Over.
Thank you very much. I mean, there is no conclusion to a webinar like this one. I'm extremely grateful to our panelists for having provided us with a certain number of benchmarks in view of assessing what's going to happen now. Very soon, the jury will be out. I mean, I picked up a few sentences that I've heard here and there. Your assessment, Catherine, that most probably nobody will like the fact that it will be proposed by the Commission. The way the German permanent representatives, the future chairman of the Coreper, expressed himself very prudently during a previously organized EPC webinar about the expectation of the presidency with regard to this a priority of its agenda. I mean, the only thing that he promised was an agreement on what he called a political roadmap at the end of the presidency, which means that there is a clear understanding that this will be a long and tedious process within the Council. I factor also in the overall assessment what you said, Vincent, about the high toxicity of highly mediatized incidents in the Mediterranean if they happen during the next weeks. And okay, we'll see, but they are likely to happen. And of course, I mean, the word border was all over the place during our discussion. But okay, people have lived behind the closed border for 3 months. It has created impediments, but it has also, for some of them, for some corner of the public opinion, I mean, suscitated a feeling of, okay, we are secure, of security. So I think that indeed, and it was also you, Vincent, who told us, I mean, there will be much less tolerance in the future for irregular, non-controlled movement of people, either at the external border or within the Schengen area. Back to Schengen, yes, we all expect this to happen, but the road might also be a bit bumpy sometimes with regard to this part of the mobility agenda of the EU. So again, the jury is out. We'll follow that up. All think tanks and others will follow that up very closely during the months and weeks to come, whether it is EPC, whether it is Egmont, the organization, ECRE also as one of the key player in the also civil society deliberation about migration issue at EU level. Again, I mean, the purpose of this webinar was simply to, set the scene and have a kind of common understanding of what the main challenges were going to be. But there will be many hard nuts to crack for sure. Let's keep on paying attention. Thank you very much for having enlightened us, Catherine, Vincent, Ola, this morning. Thanks very much to the colleagues of EPC who have supported us in the organization and the running of this event. And well, see you soon, no doubt, to continue the conversation. Goodbye, and have a nice weekend to all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.